Hello, good afternoon or good morning, maybe even good evening. Welcome back if you've been with us today. And if you're just joining, my name is Lori DeVito, and I'm co-hosting this CIE Conference with the Maastricht School of Management. And we're at our last plenary session, a panel discussion with three really esteemed scholars, and we're really thrilled to have them here today with us. In planning the conference, we thought that we wanted to end the conference with a plenary discussion about the future direction of the field. Where are we going with multi-stakeholder partnerships? We hear about them all the time, that this is what we need in order to address grand challenges. But as engaged scholars, as an engaged scholar myself, I know that collaboration isn't easy and it doesn't always work. So what can we do? What can we do to make this better, to help this come to solutions that we need? We also thought that we wanted to look at the darker side of collaborations, unintended consequences, negative effects. And we brought together our panel of esteemed scholars to explore this topic in more detail and to push the envelope of the field. And we were pleasantly surprised by the lively conversation that ensued in that conversation. And we wanted to capture that. And it all centered on power relations and dynamics. You had a bit of a tease this morning from Charlene about power relations and dynamics. Charlene also mentioned that we did a review of the papers and the conference in order to give all of our plenary speakers a better idea of what was being discussed in the conference today. And we noticed a couple things, and that is that as scholars of multi-stakeholder partnerships, we focus a lot on our Western context. And we think that we don't really see the power, our power relations are really implicit. Even though they're present, we don't really recognize them or take them into account when we study partnerships. So that's what we want to do in this plenary discussion. And it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce the esteemed scholars that we have with us today. So joining us from the US is Barbara Gray, Professor Emeritus from the Pennsylvania State University. Her decades of work is a cornerstone of partnership research in sustainability and cross-sector partnerships. From India, I believe, is Bobby Banerjee. He's professor at Bayes Business School in the UK, and his expansive work speaks critically to our assumptions of CSR and power and colonialism. And then joining us also from the UK is Rashidar Chowdhury, professor at Essex Business School. His work highlights marginalized stakeholders and victims and pushes us as researchers. Can someone please mute? Thank you. Pushes us as researchers to be more reflective about our role in our research projects and our research designs, and how we might represent or misrepresent certain stakeholder groups. Joining us in the studio next to me is Garima Sharma, assistant professor at Kogut Business School, whose work has focused on social entrepreneurship and bottom of the pyramid, and is well-versed to moderate this, what is going to be lively discussion. So I hand over to Garima now.
Thank you so much, Laurie. What a pleasure and absolute privilege to be doing this today with all of you. I'm a big fan of each of your work and so excited for this conversation. Just to start us off, what I would suggest is that we go around and each of you take just a couple of minutes just to tell everybody what's your particular angle and interest in partnerships, how may your ideas have evolved over time, and most excitingly, what are you noodling with, what are you thinking about next in terms of the questions you want to ask. So maybe Rashidar, we can start with you.
All right. I probably have quite a bit of background noise because I'm in a cafe, so apology for that. So how to start? I'm not sure because so many things are going on right now in my mind. Let me start with the story of Mullah Nasiruddin trying to find out his keys, which he thought he lost. And he was in front of his house. There is a street lamp, very tired, and couldn't find his keys. And his neighbor came to him. He's like, "What you doing?" And he was like, "I'm trying to find my keys. I have to get to my home." So they also tried to help him. And then after an hour, they were asking him again, where did you actually lose your keys? And he's like, "Oh, I lost it in forest." So, and the question is, why are you actually looking it on the street under the street lamp? It's just convenient because forest is dark. It's night, yeah, and he's tired. He doesn't want to go back to forest. So when it comes to sort of concepts like CSR, BOP, social entrepreneurship, partnership, I just oftentimes feel that we are sort of trying to find a key in the wrong place and probably asking the wrong questions. And this idea of the wrong question comes to my mind from philosophy, philosophical kind of underpinning about separation thesis. So most of the businesses or farms or even scholarship we do are kind of based on separation thesis, meaning that we can separate economics and ethics or morality or economics, whichever way you want to say that. And because we sort of try to separate them, we try to kind of create these artificial concepts like CSR, social entrepreneurship, and all sort of things. And that really doesn't solve the problem, because if those wonderful concepts were really working, why we are still in such a mess, like income inequality, environmental disaster, all sort of things. And I just want to give one small example before I hand over to any other panelists. Why separation thesis is a very important thing to understand. I would give an example of a child. When a child is born, do we really teach them how to be sort of selfish or steal money or try to be profitable, those sort of things? Not necessarily. What we try to tell the child is that behave properly, try to be honest, do all these things. From that sense, we don't really teach a child what is really economic activities and what is sort of ethical in a separated way. We kind of try to give them some sort of overall idea how to live a good life. If that is the case, and if farms, for instance, are serious about morality, ethics, we really don't need to think about partnership and all sort of things. So that's how I kind of see partnership in a kind of reverse way, that why we really need partnership if we are doing the right things, if we are morally right. Yeah.
Well, I love that provocative question. Do we really even need partnerships? And I hope we can come back to that sometime in our time today. But Barbara, would you like to share sort of your interest in partnerships?
Well, I will go back many, many years to my first project in graduate school. At that time, I had been active with a group of women in the League of Women Voters in my community. And we were concerned about redlining, which is the removal of loans to buyers of color in our community. So we actually were able to influence the banks and the lenders and our city government to convene a table of the various stakeholders to address this, because we collected data about the mortgages that had been given in the community for 7 years and found patterns of redlining. What I want to say about today's panel is that in that collaboration, if you will, that's where I began to think about collaboration, bringing these various stakeholders who had differing interests about a problem together. I was really the low power person. I wasn't the person at the table. I was an alternate, but I was allowed to study it because I had been beginning to my graduate studies at that time. And I was aware of the power dynamics at the table at the time, being the low power person. And I say this relatively because I know that if you were to put everyone in the world on a spectrum, I was a very high power person. But for this example, I was a low power person. And so my academic side wanted to describe the group dynamics and talk about what was going on and talk about power. And my collaborators in the League of Women Voters said, there is no way you are going to talk about the power dynamics in this ongoing collaboration in front of all these people. And that was a wake-up call for me to understand something about my own power at the table and how I would be giving it away if I brought it up. So my interest in power and collaboration has existed since the time I began studying partnerships. On the other hand, I've witnessed, many examples of partnerships that have been transformative, have been successful. And so in my own work, I find myself going back and forth between what good can partnerships do, what can we learn from those that work well, and how can we be critical of those that don't work well from a power perspective. And I went so far as to critique my own book, to look at it from a power perspective some years ago, in order to wrestle with these issues myself. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for sharing that story too. It's very inspiring. Thank you. Bobby, would you like to go next?
Sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I must confess, I am not by any means an expert on cross-sector partnerships. I have a nodding acquaintance with the cross-sector partnerships literature. I'm quite happy to leave it that way. My work is mainly focused on multi-stakeholder initiatives, which I guess is one form of partnership. So I've looked at how MSIs work, or rather don't work, in the extractive industries. And from a very layperson's point of view, although my work is critically engaged with stakeholder theory, I would say that partnerships perhaps suffers from the same bias as much of stakeholder theory and CSR does, but all partnerships are a form of hegemonic accommodation. And I would say, without actually doing the empirical work, that this research would have a supply-side bias, in the sense that there'll be a lot of stuff about what these partnerships are, what the driving forces are, how they work, how they don't work. Much less empirical evidence about the actual impact, I guess, on society and the environment, and from a broader perspective. So to take the example, the darling of the multi-stakeholder initiatives, the Forest Stewardship Council, which everybody places as the exemplar. Now, I have a paper under revision with some co-authors looking at the land rights in Chile, where essentially the Forest Stewardship Council was used as a weapon to neutralize resistance, a weapon to legitimize violence against the Mapuche people who were fighting for land rights. And Gail Whiteman's powerful paper on decoupling rape has directly linked with how certified companies using the FSC label were responsible for sexual violence in the local communities. And we've seen this also in Chile, not the sexual violence on, but certainly violence against local communities. Now, this is not greenwashing. Greenwashing is harmless. This is when partnerships, MSIs, become used as a deliberate smokescreen to make sure that acts of dispossession, murder continue. That's when it becomes, I guess, a problem, right? So I've been studying these violent conflicts in the extractive industries for the last 20 years, not because I like violence, because violence represents a failure of hegemony. So if the state is killing its own citizens with impunity to protect assets of multinational companies, I think we need to start looking at that more closely. And although my research has been mainly theoretical and ethnographic, if I have to model the conflicts using a statistical approach, I can tell you that the single most important predictor of violent conflict is the existence of an MSI or CSR practices, right? And that seems to be counterproductive or counterintuitive, because MSIs are supposed to talk about dialogue, right? The problem is these dialogues takes place under structurally unequal conditions. And let's not forget, dialogue is a weapon of the powerful. In terms of what I'm doing now, I just came back from the biggest market failure the world has ever seen, which is climate change. I just came back from COP27, which is essentially a market failure, a state failure, and a civil society failure. And the people who are dying by the millions are the ones who've contributed the least to the problem. So climate change is really about climate injustice in a way. So I think from a more perspective, what we need is less win-win situations right? Those are made up, those are easy, they have no meaningful impact. I think we will start looking at win-lose situations or lose-lose situations. Investigate partnerships from below, right? So partnership as co-optation, partnership for market and state failure, partnership as a neoliberal ideology, partnerships that legitimize dispossession. Right? So how do you then invert that? So what kind of radical partnerships can emerge for resistance? Partnerships for solidarity. Could you envisage Extinction Rebellion partnering with Human Rights Watch to phase out fossil fuels materially? Because obviously the costs have failed to do that. So I'll leave it there for now and we'll continue the discussion on power and around.
Yeah, and thank you so much for pushing us to think in that direction and bringing this critical lens. You know, both Laurie and I have been throughout the day sort of hearing papers and, you know, at best, the notion of power is implicit, you know, so I think it's really a fruitful discussion and we can push the conversation forward today. So Barbara, I'm going to turn back to you then to give us a little bit more sense of sort of how power really shows up in, you know, such partnerships, and especially you have this sort of brilliant paper in Arc Theory. And I love this line where you say power relations may be so deeply institutionalized that power becomes invisible. And that has huge implications for on the ground as well as researchers. How do we study that? So I would love to hear from you how you think power explicitly or implicitly shows up. And also a little bit of why should we care? I know Bobby started us off in that direction, but why should we care about this lens of power?
Thank you, Garima. I'd like to start with a definition of power so that we're talking about the same thing. For my taste, I use Castell's 2006 work when he says, power is the relational capacity that enables certain actors to asymmetrically influence the decisions of other actors that favor the empowered actor's interests and values. I'm not that far different, I think, from the views that Bobby has given in terms of where I stand looking at power in partnerships at this point. I haven't given up on them, but I feel that we haven't used a critical lens to examine why partnerships don't work. And there are many examples of partnerships that haven't worked, the Forest Stewardship Council among them, but many of the other commodity fair trade examples as well. For an interesting compilation of some of this, you could look at MSI Integrity's report of 2020, where they examined, I think it was 30 different partnerships, and come up with some of the very similar conclusions that we're articulating here. What we haven't done in partnerships, in my view, in addition to looking at the beginning, how they're constructed and whether there should even be a partnership, we need to look at how level is the table. And I don't mean to imply that the stakeholders can always have exactly the same power, but is the stakeholder table level enough that partners' voices can be heard, that their views can be considered, and that they're not, in Bobby's words, you know, contributing to the hegemony that already exists by structuring the partnership. And I think we have to take our own work into account to do that, looking back at what we've studied, where might it have gone wrong? These are some of the ways in which outcomes of partnerships have failed. People don't have a voice at the table. They're excluded from the conversation. Who bears the costs of engagement? Many of the commodity partnerships that Bobby was referring to, it's the smallholder farmers who have, in a sense, borne the costs of the partnership agreements. So they may not have had a voice represented well at the table, but in the end, the outcomes are working to their disadvantage. Which rule systems prevail when the partnership is over? Has there been any change in the overall rules of society, using Norman Fairclough's ideas of the rules of society? Does the partnership redistribute any of the power that partners had in the beginning? I mean, these are critical questions that we need to ask. Do the lower power groups accede to the demands that have been made by the parties at the table that they don't agree with? And these are questions that we don't usually ask. We look at the process dynamics, we look at the outputs, which Hans Colt makes a very interesting distinction between outputs and outcomes. The outcomes are down the road usually. We stop studying them often as soon as an agreement is reached. So we don't really look at what are the outcomes of the partnership. If you could now maybe put up the chart that we discussed. Who's doing it? Lori? Just for a moment, I just want to introduce this diagram that we have in the paper that just came out in Org Theory. I'm going to just run through it at a very brief level, and then if it's useful, we can refer to it at other times. So what we tried to look at, and I think this should tie into what Charlene was talking about this morning, although I confess I wasn't up that early to listen to her talk. Sorry, Charlene. But we can talk about 4 different kinds of fields, and the fields are mapped on this diagram according to the degree to which goals are aligned among the parties on the vertical axis and the extent of power differences among the parties. Now, granted, this is difficult to map all the power differences that are in all the stakeholders in a collaboration, but generally speaking, if you could do that, we came up with 4 different types of fields. The quiescent field is perhaps the most interesting and not discussed, and that is the one where partners' goals appear to be highly aligned, but they really aren't, and there's a substantial power difference. Our work suggests you would not collaborate if you had partners in a quiescent field. Maybe Bobby and Rashida are going to argue that all the fields are quiescent and therefore partnerships aren't needed. But if you could get to the level above that, volatile fields, at which there really are few overlapping purposes among the partners and substantial power differences, our argument is that you need to go to contention before you can even go to collaboration. So collaboration in those left 2 quadrants is not an appropriate strategy. Consciousness raising is needed in going from quiescent fields to volatile fields because marginalized people often don't even realize their own marginalization, as Paulo Freire has taught us. So the places where collaboration would be most efficacious would be where the power differences are low, where there are minimal power differences and there are not shared goals, but if the partners could get to the table, they might find some shared goals. And that's what the arrow collaboration going from the top right to the bottom right to an uncontested field. The last arrow in the diagram might be a field that appears to have agreements and contestation, but the power dynamics shift and you move back into a case where people are. So I'll stop there. It's a very robust framework. We can't go into all the details of it now, but I thought it might be useful for those of you that want to try to put a lens on your own research to see whether or not you could place your collaborative table, the partnership that you're studying in these various, on this various diagram and see whether or not it could account for why there wasn't a successful outcome, for example.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very robust framework. And you seem to already do that, Barbara, but maybe I'll bounce your question to Rashida then. The idea that could there be partnerships or fields where there are no power differences? Is that even possible?
So again, as Bobby said, he's probably not the expert in partnership. I'm also not expert in partnership literature, but what I want to sort of share is sort of my experience from Bangladesh, where I have been sort of visiting for a long time, and also because of family connections, I got to know a lot of things which probably a bit harder for a general person to know. And so I think there are kind of a few things going on in terms of if we think about partnership or MSI. So I would start with Rana Plaza collapse, where I sort of spent a lot of time to understand why it collapsed or how it occurred and what happened later on. And one of the interesting thing about the collapse was that there were about 31 multinationals companies like Walmart, Benetton sourcing from that building. and there were five garment suppliers, Bangladeshi suppliers who were kind of producing clothes for them. I managed to talk with few sort of like corporate officials in Bangladesh, and one of them, this person comes from a very world's one of the greatest brands, if I say so, and he was saying that the day after the Rana Plaza collapse, their company get rid of 40% of their suppliers in Bangladesh. And that's interesting, I tell you why. All this fuss about accord and alliance that, hey, bring trade unions, do that, do this, were so meaningless, because if corporations really want to get rid of bad suppliers, they can. That was that guy's point. Do you think that 500-600 people in the HQ in Bangladesh running the supply chain, we have no idea who does what? Of course we know how things work, but it's all about cost. Yeah. So I went to sort of like try to see what does really cost me. So I followed this middleman in London, and there's an interesting story about like how you try to fight for 1p. So what the middlemen do is like they negotiate with the buyer and the supplier, and they try to kind of sell products. And imagine like if you can save 1p per jeans, and you're selling millions of jeans, you can actually save lots of money for buyer or supplier, depends for whom you're really working. By all this mean, what I try to kind of indicate is that you really don't need lots of collaborations, partnerships. What you really need is a mindset to see whether you want to actually do a fair thing to people. If corporations want to sort out supply chain, want to kind of pay fair price, want to improve the conditions of labor, I think they can do a lot themselves. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do partnership or you shouldn't engage. I would go back to this analogy of the child, how we raise a child as a family. Yeah? Do we actually tell our kids that, hey, let's make a partnership, parents and child partnership? It's like a community, it's like a collective effort. You're trying to get things sorted in your family. Yeah, I mean, you don't use that sort of concepts. So the way I kind of see that, like we need to change our mindset, and that comes to the example of the key. That all these partnerships, ESI, MSI, very tiring in the sense that these are all about how you can dominate others. Why don't we just flip the sort of board and try to see everything through the poor people, marginalized stakeholders? And I think then we can have a very different answers about everything. So in that sense, like, I think obviously sustainability is an interesting thing. For instance, we all talk about sustainability and everyone wants to be sustainable, and we all know how unsustainable we are. And take the example of the fast fashion. I mean, everyone wants to help those poor people in Bangladesh, but no one wants to give a fast fashion in Europe or US. I mean, this is, to be honest, if I use a really interesting word or a bit strong, this is really a joke. We know where the problem is, and then we go to Bangladesh and, we created this wonderful institution called Accord, and we are exploiting less, or no accidents is happening. I mean, come on, in Bangladesh, last 10 years, there was no fair election. Even if accident happens, things don't come to newspaper properly. So we are really looking into the wrong place with wrong things. That mindset has to be changed before we trying to sort out things for others. That's how I sort of see the power that. And when you say that with the power, kind of this quotation that power is invisible or implicit, to me, power is the most explicit thing I ever experienced in the Western countries. This is like ruthless things where you go to Bangladesh and talk with those victims of garments workers, I mean, even myself, I mean, I can immediately see I'm so powerful, and these guys really understand that. I mean, there is no hide and seek game. I mean, power is exercised in an extremely violent way, even when we go do research in poor countries. So I think we have a lot to think how we kind of sort of bring back the issue of morality and ethics. That seems like a kind of under the radar, and we are focusing too much on different concepts because that helps us with citations and all sort of things. So we need to really start rethinking how we can actually genuinely do scholarship, which would be helpful for the work.
Yeah. And in many ways, if power is so explicit, then why is it so missing from our research conversation in this particular literature? Not missing, but not as primary. And maybe we can come back to that as our roles as researchers do in a little bit. But I want to go to Bobby next. And Bobby, in many ways, our conversation today was really your provocation when we met in our own small group, trying to figure the focus of our conversation today. And you really sort of challenged us, and you mentioned that a little bit in the beginning. How can we reimagine different kinds of partnership? And I really found it stuck in my mind the way you said lose-lose or win-lose partnerships. And so I would love for you to give it a little bit more details, and also being critical about your own critical thinking. Sort of what are the even limits of making that happen?
I have a slightly different take on power, because I think one of the major structural weaknesses in all our fields in management organization studies, particularly institutional theory, is a very weak, unsophisticated analysis of power, which is not there in other disciplines. We seem to suffer from this bias. But before I do that, I just want to push, I guess, a comment on Rush's point about the Accord. The elephant in the room, as he said, is not about worker safety. The elephant in the room is the cost price, right? And since the Rana Plaza disaster, which is about 10 years now, the actual cost price has gone down by 14%. I may have the actual percentage wrong. So instead of price going up, they've actually managed to negotiate even a lower price, which means what? Who's going to suffer from that, right? So what the Accord does is give legitimacy to powerful actors, Western unions, big brands. I was on a panel who were promoting the Accord. They'll never invite me again. And they mentioned the same point. There's not been a single death since the Accord was signed. So I said, if death is your major dependent variable, you need to change your theory. There's something wrong if that's going to be a kind of figure. Anyway, I want to get back to power, because that really is I guess, the crux of the matter. As I said, I think power has been theorized inadequately in our field. And I think it's especially institutional theory. It's been very instrumental, it's decontextualized, it's unsophisticated, where power is almost conceptualized as some kind of an endogenous variable. And it's not just institutional theory. Similar illusions are in stakeholder theory. So if you look at Mitchell, Agles, and Wood's famous typology of stakeholder salience of power, legitimacy, and urgency, power and legitimacy are almost defined as discrete, separate concepts, right? Without an understanding that legitimacy is an outcome of relations of power, yeah? Let's not forget that not too long ago, apartheid was legitimate, segregation was legitimate, slavery was legitimate, yeah? You will find a much more sophisticated analysis of power in critical management studies, but nobody listens to them anyway. Most papers will talk about institutional power, material power, and some will talk about discursive power. My critique is at a slightly more broader level. It is a level of epistemic power, from where I argue all power emanates. And this goes back to the work of Foucault in his notion of epistemes, which are the rules of formation, yeah, which govern what are called legitimate forms of knowledge. So the connection of power knowledge, that you cannot separate power from knowledge, right? So these are the underlying codes of a culture. So epistemic power there is really about power knowledge, deeply intertwined, cannot be separated. What we are discussing at the conference today is a form of epistemic power as well, right? Now, the episteme that dominates our field, right? The only legitimate ways of knowing are Western European knowledge systems, right? Based on the Enlightenment values. This could be also be called the colonial episteme that has, over the centuries, subjugated, delegitimized, co-opted, or appropriated other knowledge systems, which are, I guess, in quite contrastingly different from the way we see the world. So I guess in some of my work, I've used a post-colonial framework to analyze these violent conflicts in the extractive industry. So how epistemic power dominates marginalized populations. So if knowledge is power, then from a decolonial perspective, the acceptance of the epistemic contributions of those who have been historically marked as without knowledge, we need to start engaging with that as a necessary corrective, I guess, for indigenous peoples who have to kind of emerge then from this epistemic conquest, if you will. So that then leads us then to epistemic power and epistemic influence, right? So what's the big deal of epistemic power? Why should we care about it? Because the exercise of epistemic power, like any power, inevitably gives rise to injustice, right? So epistemic injustice then becomes the improper use of epistemic power. So for populations with alternative knowledge systems, like indigenous peoples, the fight for epistemic justice is a real fight to protect them from this kind of epistemic dominance, right? So that kind of relation of power and justice becomes forefront of any kind of critical analysis. So what epistemic power does, it creates a discursive space, yeah? It's a set of positionalities, a network of economic and power relations, right? Which has direct material effects as well. So if you look at, for example, popular discourses, globalization, development, climate change, the war on terror, economic growth, intellectual property, these are all discursive and material effects of a particular epistemic power, right? And it is this power that creates binaries: modern, primitive; developed, underdeveloped; advanced, backwards; civilized, barbaric, yeah? Where knowledge, authority, and agency always remains on the side of the modern, the developed, and the advanced, right? This is where the third world space is again created. So what happens then is this knowledge linked to power then assumes the authority of the truth. It has the power to make itself true, yeah? That's what is called the truth effect. And these practices are discursive because they reproduce knowledge through practices which are made possible by the structural assumptions of that knowledge. And there is very little engagement, I guess, with that understanding. And this is the knowledge system of colonialism, which is why there is a need then for us to start decolonizing what epistemic power is all about.
Wow, there's lots to unpack there, and especially the phrase epistemic power. I think it is applicable not only in partnerships. I think it is really, you're making us think even more broadly. I think it's also a good time to maybe check in and see if there are any audience questions. Laurie, do we have anything you want to ask?
I don't see any questions yet. Is there anyone who maybe would like to raise their hand and ask a question to the panel? Yes, I see. Wakas? Please unmute and yeah, you can pose your question. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this lively discussion. My name is Wakas Tawad. I'm from Queen's University. My question is for Bobby. And so I really like the argument of this win, lose, or lose. But don't you think that it is the other extreme of idealism? I mean, would any organization be willing to put themselves in this position of lose? Or, I mean, how can we, as a society, enforce that win-lose argument or lose-lose argument?
No, I wasn't going to say we should have lose-lose situations. My point is that the research which talks about only focuses on the win-win. And my point was that these obscure processes of dispossession. So nobody would like a lose-lose. I just came back from a lose-lose conference. I just came back from COP27. That is an ideal example of a lose-lose, right? The problem is, as I said, it's an unjust lose-lose because the people are not contributing, the people who have contributed the least are dying, right? So my point is to focus really on taking a much more critical approach to what we are classifying as win. Yeah. So no corporation is going to lose, but they produce disempowering effects. That has not been documented or studied as much as it should.
No more? Mm-hmm.
Maybe
Should we just go ahead then and then come back to the audience question? All right, so Barbara, I want to come sort of back to you in many ways. You know, Bobby and Rashidar are introducing us to this really critical lens that, challenging even the notion of partnerships, introducing to the idea of epistemic power. But you also have this really solid body of work across the years that people have used and found value in. So I would love to hear from you if you have any reactions to what Bobby and Rashidar have said so far, and sort of what are you thinking in response to some of the ideas suggested in questioning the need of partnerships or this notion of epistemic power, epistemic authority, epistemic power?
I do. I would like to ask Bobby, for example, if you look at the diagram that I showed before, if we're talking about a quiescent field where the power dynamics are as lopsided as you have suggested, what should we do? I mean, my answer to that is we don't partner. We don't partner in those situations. We can't begin to expect the outcomes. And I think that's been one of our sort of idealistic views that we've had in this field, is that we can simply put people around a table, no matter what their power difference is, no matter what the context in which they are negotiating is, and expect to get a collaborative outcome. That's not where I stand. And I think that in that circumstance, if we want to make change in society, we have to do organizing. We have to go back to mobilization. And so I think we are on the same page around that, but I didn't hear you speak to that. So, and Rashida, I think the comment would be the same for you. I read your paper on marginalized voices. What do we do? I think we can help these young scholars think about their own work by giving them concrete examples about how do we have a conversation about morals. Morals are different. I studied a conflict in northern Minnesota where what was moral for one group was absolutely not moral for another group. So it's not as simple to me as talking about finding the moral values. We have to dig down to how do we bring people who are on the ground hurting each other together in some way, and when do we do that versus when do we beef them up and help them mobilize so that they can begin to get a voice at all. So those are my questions back to each of you.
Either of you, please.
I think in terms of the outcomes we want, I don't think we're going to be that different. Nobody wants violence as an outcome. But to get back to your question was what we should be doing, I guess the first question I asked myself is, who is this we? Does we assume some kind of singular humanity, which I think is a problematic notion, which is also my critique of this question of Anthropocene. So we as researchers, we as engaged scholars, we as dispassionate researchers, we as activists. But your point about, yes, putting people together at the table is not going to work. As I said, a dialogue is a weapon of the powerful. In my work with Aboriginal communities in Australia, it was very hard for me to try and explain to the consultative committees, the states, including the NGOs, that Aboriginal communities who do not show up for a consultation meeting is a form of resistance. They keep saying, oh, they didn't show up, they're not interested. I said, no, because they're going to show up in a place which they are set up to fail. Not showing up is resistance, right? And then they would pass that, and then there would be violence, right? So that's what I meant. So in terms of simply understanding the fact that having a dialogue under unequal conditions is just not going to happen. And again, COP27 is a classic example. It's so inclusive, not counting Egypt, but the previous ones were quite, quote, inclusive. What does inclusive actually mean, right? You might have a voice, but you have no seat at the table. You don't really have the power to make decisions. I'll give you one quick example, and then we can move on. But
that's the UN structure, right? We just say that's the UN structure.
That's the UN structure. No, but I'll also tell you, of course, we are also caught up on democracy. The UN is not democratic, right? So I'll give you a simple example of how undemocratic and non-transparent and non-accountable this whole COP business is. My first COP was at Durban in South Africa, 2011. And I was doing research on mining industries and emissions. Now at Durban, they have open sessions and closed sessions. So I was a designated observer, which means I could observe the negotiations, but I could not ask questions. I could, however, participate in the side events. There was one session I really wanted to go to. It was directly related to a paper I was working on, It was on mining, on carbon emissions in the mining industry, which is basically my research. And of course, I found it a closed session, and I tried to, charm my way through. I wore a jacket and a tie, comb my hair. It didn't work. I was turned away very
Trying to look
politely.
legitimate, right?
So I was turned away very politely to a closed session on mining industry and carbon emissions. I am not a paid consultant. I don't work for companies. The taxpayer pays my salary. I work for a public university. I am not allowed into that meeting, which is going to make global policy. Behind me are the CEOs of Shell, Rio Tinto, and BP going in with the ministers to hammer out a deal on carbon emissions in their industry. I'm not allowed. Behind me, there was a young woman from Friends of the Earth. She was trying to be more forceful. She was also not allowed. How is this democratic? When you've got the oil companies and the ministers making decisions on global climate policy, right? And this is the fundamental flaw in this process. It doesn't matter how inclusive you want to be. The point is that there are these powerful interests. At COP27, there were 643 fossil fuel lobbyists. About 35 of them were official country delegates, which means they were negotiating on behalf of the countries. These are fossil fuel lobbyists, right? How come there is no civil society people in those closed groups? That's my fundamental problem.
So don't you think that's back to the design of the table in the first place? I mean, that was a flawed table. That's not it's not equal, and it's not a forum in which voices that need to be heard can be heard.
Right.
So how do we change the forums, I guess would be the question then, right? Can we even change the forums in which these conversations take place so that they can have more voices?
Yeah, which is why you saw 100,000 people marching in Glasgow last year on the streets. So I think people have realized that it's not going to work. So the only way we can do this is direct action, I guess, at one level, which is what I was saying. We need to look at some radical partnerships, which is the only thing that's going to stop the extraction is not going to be COP27 or COP28. It's going to be radical action.
If I may interject a couple questions here from the audience, I'll try to.
We didn't hear Rashidar's comments. My question.
Go ahead, Rashidar.
Okay. So I recently wrote a paper on misrepresentation of marginalized groups, and there was a critique of which I call epistemic neocolonialism. What I want to say that, at least as a researcher, what we can do is try to be sensitive and try not to be ignorant about facts, or start asking common sense questions. So what does common sense mean? I mean, we probably don't have much time, but I just want to bring this idea of the double consciousness of Du Bois. And it's about sort of like seeing yourself through your own eyes and by others. And oftentimes Black people are sort of like subject to double consciousness, and they're kind of ignored and subject to sort of insensitive behavior and those sort of things. And actually that applies to most of them, or majority of the marginalized people. They are ignored. They are not really taken seriously, even if we try to claim that they are taken seriously or we pay attention to them. But sometimes, or oftentimes, we actually even lack mechanism to figure out how we can do that. So one of the things I try to sort of like, I mean, there are many things, but one thing I wanted to kind of bring in that paper is the idea of the oppositional view, that everyone, even a white person in a way, could have a double consciousness in the way that not all white person are kind of bad. Yeah, I mean, that would be kind of like an extreme sort of way to kind of see the world. So everyone has a double consciousness, and how our double consciousness sort of interact with the marginalized people's double consciousness is important. Because when we try to pursue a particular theory, most of the time we kind of think about our sort of paradigm where we work and how we work, and sort of the ideas or agenda we want to push forward. Rather than doing that, I think if we sort of take the double consciousness of the marginalized people, how they feel, how they want to see the world, and try to kind of interact with those sort of ideas and challenge ourselves, and try to kind of create ways to kind of see the world. I think that can sort of create a much better path or much better mechanisms to be sensitive and kind of pay attention to how we are not ignorant in particular spaces. Because my understanding is that when you go to field work or when you interact with these people whom you want to bring to the table, in order to do that, you need to change the mindset. Because oftentimes I hear even academics saying that, oh, these people don't understand or not educated, not politically aware. That even exists among academics. It's kind of a universal prejudice against these people. So when we, especially Barbara, when you mention about dialogues, to me always the greatest wonder, I mean, do we really think that these people we're talking about are worthy of dialogue with us, sitting on the same table? And when you kind of talk privately, that expression is very prominent, that what they understand about these issues, how they really understand. And so I think there's a lot of things. I'm going back to this idea of the mindset needs to be changed, even before inviting someone onto the table and how we want to invite them. So we need to change the epistemology we use to study those people. And I'm not claiming that I have a solution, but I think that's what we need to look for. And that's important. I would use another term which I use, it's called insensitive violence. So there's a lot of limited traceability how, for instance, ignorance, insensitivity, all sort of things happen towards these marginalized people. So as a social scientist, we often, and for a right reason, always try to find facts, always try to find figures. So I like the idea, the example Bobby gave about whether anyone died since the Accord. It's a way that, oh, okay, there are no newspaper articles sort of talking about some people died due to some sort of accident in any of the factories or whatever. That's the issue of limited traceability, because you don't have information on newspaper or, I don't know, internet, doesn't mean that nobody died. Nobody injured. It's just like we don't have the right mechanism to figure out what's really happening in the field. So that's ignorance and insensitivity we need to overcome. We need to start asking very common sense questions. I think that's sort of missing in the sense that I'm trying to make it very, very sort of, I don't know, general, in the sense that too much theorization of everything, but really not looking at the facts or common sense things, which is sort of in front of us. I think that's very important to address.
Maybe I can throw in a couple of the questions from the audience now. They've seemed to become more active. I will try to summarize a few, because I think that they're all along the same theme, and that is really what is the alternative? So one is like COP27. Well, what's the alternative? What can we look towards? Or if these power symmetrics or power asymmetric relations are in worker-employer or supplier-based relations, what else can we do? What else can we expect, actually, if they're inherent in these things? And another one, perhaps along the same line, is if there are no partnerships, then what else would there be? Can we expect more legislation? So really, I think all of these are really speaking towards what are the alternatives if partnerships aren't working. If you have thoughts on that.
Let me take the COP question, because I just had a piece published last week in the Conversation where I called for an end to all COPs. Let COP become another Davos. COP is a conference for the rich and of the rich. So let them do it. And I just said the civil society actors should boycott it and put their attention at the national and local levels. Keep the governments accountable. In terms of alternatives, yes, it is, I think, direct action to the governments who have signed up. for their targets, which will never get implemented, but anyway. But I'll tell you a very simple, practical thing. Somebody talked about regulation. It is very simple to do. Climate finance, which is the next big thing, what we are doing is we are financing essentially the destruction of our planet through fossil fuels. This whole con job of ESG is essentially giving misleading information, right? That has to stop in a way. So in 2009, the president of Ecuador, he said, ask for $4 billion not to drill for oil. Keep the oil on the ground, yes. We are completely into climate change. We will not dig, but I need $3.9 billion, which is the market price of oil then, to keep the oil on the ground. Not a single ESG green investor was willing to pay $3 billion. 2 years ago, investors paid close to $40 billion for Saudi Arabia's oil company, Aramco, IPO. That's what we are funding. So when the UN chief said that this is collective suicide, that's exactly what our finance people are doing. Very simple. Pass a law which makes it illegal to raise money from capital markets for fossil fuel extraction. That can be done tomorrow like this across the world. Simple. You cannot take money from capital markets for fossil fuel companies, extraction. There's enough coal in the ground now for another 275 years. How does that stay on the ground? Through direct action, through legislation. It's not going to happen through law, that's for sure.
Try to pass that in the United States, Bobby.
Yeah.
We can't get any kind of an agreement about that kind of attitude toward our planet.
I mean, the US has moved from natural gas, and this is the biggest con job. The biggest COP27, the biggest achievement was classifying natural gas not as a fossil fuel, which it is, but as a transition fuel. That's what happened now. So now you'll get all the subsidies, the big oil companies don't get them. Oil is not dirty, so let's move to natural gas. Problems to remain.
Could I add one comment about who we are and what we might do? Because I think that may be a question that many of the audience participants have. I'm going to use a very simple example, race relations in the US. My husband and I live in a lake community. It's not very racially diverse, but people around here put signs like Confederate flags on their boats. And we can see this from our home, and we were offended. We wanted to change it. My husband's on the board, so he had a platform for raising it. And no one understood. No one in the board understood why that was a concern. And this is a very simple example. I'm not solving the world's oil problems. But what this says to me is that we, my husband and I, and others who look similarly, need to use our voices to educate our peers about the oppression that they're contributing to. And so just the other day, I was standing in the shower thinking, okay, I think I'm going to ask the board chair to go for tea or coffee and try to say, it seems like there's a disconnect here that maybe we could try to understand a little bit better. To me, that's like, how do we solve this giant issue of racism in the US? It's got to start with those of us that have some measure of power. And as academics, we have it. We have some. We don't, we're not oil companies, we're not financiers, but we can start with the power that we have and call to the carpet our own behavior. And this is what I'm asking scholars to do in our research as well, is to do the kind of critical thinking that Bobby and Rashida are suggesting we do. Look at our own research, look at our own studies, and see if there's embedded as epistemic power. That's our work. Thank you.
Well, we're almost, I think, at the end of our time together. Rashida, I want to give you maybe like 30 seconds to get your voice in. Any last comments?
Wow, I don't know. Just last comment is, I think there is a kind of what really bothered me about academia and troubled me in a way that there's a lot of openness when we come collectively in these sort of platforms, which is great. This sort of openness is great and many things to learn. But I think when it comes to individuals, I think there's a lot of power play. There's a lot of backdoor kind of politics. And I often think that why sort of radical or critical stuff don't get published in top journals and those sort of things. Literally last 7-8 years, these top journals squeeze me in a way that I only publish JBE and BEQ type of journals. I mean, anything I send would be rejected, and people not even privately, publicly says what he does know about research. Make sort of like allegation that I fabricate their arguments and these sort of things. So I think there's a lot of problems in academia which needs to be solved before we actually lecture other people that, hey guys, do this or that. I mean, I just look at ourselves and it's like what we are doing here in this kind of power structure. Before lecturing others, I think we need to sort out ourselves and get our sort of kind of the agenda right. And we need to be genuine and authentic and transparent. I think academia lacks transparency, unfortunately. And that's obviously the case with lots of corporations. I mean, just take example of tax haven. I mean, if you actually get rid of all the tax haven, probably most of the problem would be solved. Or if you get rid of, like, I don't know, arms trades, most of the killings would be stopped. But still, all these things are happening. We know these are bad things, but why these things happen? So I think those are the kind of questions we need to ask, and we need to start seeing ourselves and also see how the world can be a better place by doing different type of alternative work and being truly open-minded, not only publicly, but also privately. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you actually to all of you. I'm deeply grateful for how you've pushed our thinking today, the nuggets you've offered us to sort of start thinking about how we can reimagine the work that we're doing in partnership and the work we're doing as academics outside of, just knowledge production, but also joining the conversation and making a difference. So thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to pass it on to Laurie to close us off.
Thank you. Thank you, Garima. Thank you, Bobby and Barbara and Rashidar. Really a thought-provoking conversation, and one that I think we could have talked for a bit longer on, but we have a tight deadline to leave the building at 6. So I'm going to have to close really quickly. And I hope we can continue the conversation, and somehow, I'm not sure how. This is a really great community and good thinking of moving partnerships along to the next level. So I will think about how we can meet each other again in the future. Before leaving, maybe you can put a takeaway in the chat for us, something that struck you today as I go through my long list of thank yous. So it would be really great to hear your feedback on what you thought was really inspiring for today, or surprising, or what spoke to you. So, of course, I want to thank Charlene and Barbara and Bobby and Rashidar and Garima and Yakumin for moderating sessions today and stimulating our thoughts in their plenary talks and the discussion we just had. I also want to thank all of our paper presenters and our discussants and our chairs. I think we had great parallel paper sessions, and I hope everyone enjoyed the ones that they were in. I want to actually shout out to our PhD students and early career scholars that we had here yesterday, who were also playing roles in the sessions today as well. It's just really inspiring to have them on site and to create bonds with them. And of course, the team behind the scenes, Zita and Firla and Angela, who helped us organize all of this together with Maastricht School of Management, and Science Vision, who are here in the studio and made it all work like clockwork. So a real big heartfelt thanks to all of you who came and took the time out of your busy schedules to spend a day with us and connect as a community. So please link in with us, and hopefully together we'll make more progress in the success of partnerships. So after that, I have to think about saying that, but I believe in that. Okay, thank you, and until next time.